Hey everyone, and welcome to the fifth episode of the Climate Com podcast. And today I'm joined by James Corbett from the Corbett Report. I'm sure many of you already heard about his work, and we're going to get into all things related to the Climate Con. So, hi James, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, just in case anybody hasn't heard about you and your work, what is it that you do, and could you give a bit of an intro about yourself?
Sure. Well, I am a Canadian born and raised who went to Ireland for a year to study some Anglo-Irish literature, see what they had to know, and then was looking for something to do with my life. I decided to go to Japan to spend a year teaching English and seeing another part of the world. And that 1 year ended up turning into 18 years now, 19 years? Anyway, a long time, to the point where I can't even keep count. But during that process of living in Japan and finding myself here, I decided to start a website, and that became the Corbett Report. And that was back in 2007. I started the podcast before podcasting was cool or even a known thing. I started it back in 2007, and since then it's grown and grown and grown. And so if people haven't encountered it before, it's at corbettreport.com. I talk about science, I talk about history, I talk about politics, I talk about philosophy, I talk about all sorts of things, basically anything I'm interested in. And the Great Climate Con is definitely one of those subjects I've been covering since the beginning.
Ah, cool. Yeah, we can get into that. And I was curious, actually, as you mentioned, you're in Japan. Is there much of a reception to what you speak about and to people there?
Well, since I operate in English and most of Japan doesn't, that
Yeah.
actually insulates me from the people around me in my physical space here. So I have actually been recognized once or twice here in Japan, but generally by expats, not
Oh,
by
yeah.
Japanese. There are some, I know I do have some Japanese listeners, but not a lot. Just overall, I would say it's probably, well, I don't know. I don't know. Every country is going to be different, isn't it? But I want to say it's probably similar to like if I was in Canada. There are certainly people who are involved in spreading information through alt media and getting information through alt media, and there are people who aren't just accepting whatever the establishment media is telling them. But those people are probably outnumbered at this point, and the average person on the street is a blue-pilled normie.
Yes.
So I think it's probably like that in many places around the globe right now.
Yeah, and I wonder if we're going to ever reach a tipping point in that. How would you think?
If I didn't think so, I wouldn't be here. I think it is possible. And I don't even know what tipping point means necessarily. I don't know if it's 50% plus one of the population or whether it's just a significant enough percent of the population that we can show. And in fact, we've probably already reached that, whatever that tipping point is. It's just that obviously the establishment media isn't going to report on that and say, hey
Yeah,
guys, you
yeah,
know
yeah.
what? You're right. You're not crazy. And in fact, many people believe what you believe. I was just refreshing my memory on some of those polls that have been done about, oh, half of New Yorkers back in 2006 believed they were lied to about 9/11. And one number that stuck out for me from 2001, 81% of Americans knew that JFK was assassinated as the result of a conspiracy. 81%. And yet,
Jeez.
throughout my
Yeah.
entire life, it has always been this unspeakable, ridiculous, laughable conspiracy nonsense to suggest that there may have been a conspiracy involved in the JFK assassination, even though that was actually the US government's final official say on the matter in the House Select Committee's Committee on Assassinations back in the 1970s. But details, schmeetails, you're crazy if you believe that, like 81% of the American population.
Fascinating. Yeah, that's a pretty huge statistic, man. All right.
It's it's stunning, isn't it? And it says so much about the type of media control that we're under that most people do believe that they're in the minority on things like that.
Yeah, and I don't know what it's like in the States, but I know here that the media, people watching the actual mainstream media, it's going down. And the BBC is, I remember seeing a while ago, it's like a ticking time bomb till I don't know, maybe till it finally dies, or it just becomes useless.
One could hope.
Yes. And so you said you've been doing this since 2007. What have been some of the challenges that you faced during that time? Because that's a serious long time to be in this fight, man.
It is, and there's so many different things that have occurred along the way. I guess something that took me by surprise when I went into this, I was quite convinced that there in 2007, it was still a crazy thing to go out there screaming 9/11 was an inside job and whatever else I was talking about at that time. I thought I was going to get a lot more pushback than I actually did end up getting. And that's probably because the types of people who are finding obscure alt media podcasts in 2007 are probably the people who are looking for that information. So it turned out that a lot of the people that I was talking to were people who wanted to hear what I was saying. So I didn't get as much of that type of pushback as I had initially thought I would. But obviously, as reach expands and as more people start to get on board and watch podcasts and watch strange formerly YouTube channels, etc. And I started to gain more of a following. Of course, there's more of that pushback. But the one issue, the single issue that I received the most pushback about in my entire podcasting career has been the climate issue. Because even people who are on board with a lot of the other things that I talk about, all of these other false flag conspiracy theories and all these other things that I talk about, yeah, that's fine. But the idea that we are not, in fact, careening towards climate Armageddon because of your, what car you drive is just mind-blowing to so many people. And I've received the most pushback on that particular subject.
Yeah, I seem to find it can be very emotional for people. They get very, very defensive, and they really want to believe that we're all about to die and that they have to restrict their way of lived life to save us. I wonder why it's so strong for people
In
to hold that
fact,
belief.
I won't get it out because it's at the very bottom of that pile. But Superabundance by Tupi and Pooley is a book that I read recently that I don't necessarily agree with the entirety of the book, but I think it makes a fairly convincing point that, in fact, the world is much more abundant than most people think, that the constant cries of environmental crisis, chicken sky is falling pronouncements of the hijacked green environmental movement, which is not what most people think it is not only just wrong, it actually appeals to people's desire for some sort of apocalypse. They want to be the characters living through some sort of apocalyptic movie. Yeah. And thus, when people come along screaming, everything's horrible, the entire planet's in danger. But hey, guys, if you throw tomato soup on this painting, you can save the world. People that's a very powerful idea for people. And there is clearly a religious aspect to what's going on with all of this that I think is deliberately played on to some extent.
That's interesting. And what more about that book? Like, what is abundant on the earth that we usually are told that's not?
Well, essentially everything. I think they're sort of expanding on Julian Simon's work. He wrote The Ultimate Resource and The Ultimate Resource 2. He wrote other things. I've talked about this in a Questions for Corbett podcast episode I did called Are There Limits to Growth? Talking about the limits to growth from the Club of Rome from the 1970s, which was quite famous at the time, predicting, oh my God, the sky is falling, the world is ending. We're going to run out of everything because there are too many people and we're using too much stuff and all our resources are going to go, and basically apocalypse by about, we'll say 50 years because we'll all be dead by that time. Well, it has now been 50 years since the limits to growth. And so bizarrely enough, a couple of years ago, there were all these articles in Vice and other prime journalistic outlets saying, hey guys, the Club of Rome predicted the end of the world 50 years ago, and they're right on target, which is laughable for so many reasons. One of which is because if you go back to the actual limits to growth, which was a sort of a study that was based on this computer model that they had created of the Earth, that in about the year 2000, they had to admit, oops, we said we were going to be running out of this material and this material and this material and this material, and we were basically going to be at this part of the chart. As it turns out, we were a little bit wrong. So we'll just have to double the starting assumptions that we had in our model 30 years ago and rerun it. And now we show we're still right on track. Don't worry, guys. We've fiddled with the numbers enough that, look, it's climate Armageddon, I tell you. Which, again, speaks to some of the statistical manipulation that goes on with this. Again, I would really suggest people who are interested in that topic, please look at my my video about that. But essentially, Julian Simon was famous in the 1980s for running a bet with Paul Ehrlich. Oh my God, the world is dying. We're all going to starve to death by the year 2000. Paul Ehrlich, who is still hailed as some sort of rock star super scientist, even though he's been wrong about everything he has ever said. But in the 1980s, Julian Simon had a bet with Paul Ehrlich. He said, pick any 5 materials you want. Any 5 materials. And I bet that by the end of the decade, the price of those materials will actually have gone down. Paul Ehrlich took the other side of that bet. Okay, I'll pick this one and this one, this one, this one, this one. And at the end of the decade, they checked and, oh, guess what? Yes, the prices of all of those materials had gone down. Paul Ehrlich had to write a check to Julian Simon. as admission that he was wrong, that he conceded defeat. But of course, he didn't go around saying, "Oh, I was all wrong. Looks like we can throw out all my scaremongering." No, he's like he said, "Oh, it's just that because of this decade that we chose, and because of these factors, blah blah blah." But Julian Simon's point stands. On the long run, the world is becoming more abundant the more people are on this planet, which sounds insane until you realize what is really being said here. When he says the ultimate resource is human brain power, he is saying that we, as thinking, intelligent beings, are not living on a fixed pie and we're just eating the pie away and it will be gone. We are actually creating things that transform our understanding of what materials exist and what they're useful for. Hundreds of years ago, what's this horrible brown stuff bubbling up from the ground that's polluting our water? We don't need that. And then, we can do this with that. Oh, we can do this with that. Oh, industrial revolution. We can create so much more with this. So that's the level at superabundance, and what that means. That in fact, as more people are added to the human population, we become actually more abundant. And that's a hard thing to get your mind around. And it doesn't appeal to people's sense of oh my god, the world is ending, we must save it, which is unfortunately, as I say, a very appealing concept for a lot of people.
Yeah, and that's absolutely fascinating, man. And it very much goes against the depopulation agenda, and what a lot of people believe is like we have to reduce the amount of people here. And I've always like felt like that's off, that's not right. And to have you explain that makes a lot of sense, and that's quite cool. And what were the 5 materials that you mentioned that they did a bet on? Can you remember?
I would definitely have to look that up. I can't remember off the top of my head.
Okay, no
I
worries.
think tin was in there, maybe molybdenum. I'd really have to check.
Sure. And on the subject of oil, though, I mean, I've been hearing this float around a little bit, that it's not actually what we're taught it is. It's kind of renewable. Now, I don't know. I can't, I haven't looked into it enough. But have you ever looked into that?
I have. I had a podcast on this way back, probably 2007 or 2008, very, very early on, that people can check into. I think it was called Peak Oil is a Fraud. Anyway, just type peak oil into my search. And the idea here is abiogenesis of oil, as in there is oil that can be created through the process that they talk about of basically compacting dinosaur bones and what have you. But actually, this incredibly abundant material, it's all over the place, that we're consuming millions and millions of barrels per day. Maybe that isn't all from crushed up dinosaur bones, but where else could it possibly be? And so basically there was an entire Russian Soviet sort of branch of petrochemical science that got discarded with the fall of the Soviet Union, because what did those stupid Ruskies know? Of course, actually now Russia is one of the largest oil producers on the planet, so maybe they knew something about what they were talking about. But there was this entire field of study of abiogenesis of oil, as in oil being created from the mantle of the earth through some process. I don't pretend to know all the details of what they were talking about, but basically the idea was, if you drill far enough down, you're going to find oil, because it is being produced in the earth's crust. And they did manage to find an awful lot of oil with that theory, at any rate. And if that is true, and if it is true, as it has been demonstrated, that there's a number of oil wells that have been drilled and pumped, and it's done producing, and then when they go back decades later, it's filled again. Well, how is there more oil in here? We pumped it all. Well, it's almost as if it's coming from somewhere. So that's an entire subject unto itself. But the interesting thing about the history of oil, which I did talk about, I did a 2-part documentary, How and Why Big Oil Conquered the World. It's at corbettreport.com/big oil. The interesting thing, when you really start reading about the oil industry, the old oil barons, the people from way back at the beginning of the oil industry, the problem was always too much oil. They're pumping too much.
Right.
It's going to the price is going to go down. We need to restrict the supply. That has always been the overriding concern of the oil barons, and they've managed to turn this around into people really demanding that oil production be restricted, and no pipelines and no drilling and all of this, which, oh no, oh dear, well, it's just going to cost you $200 a barrel or whatever price they want. So it's again, it's sort of spinning gold from straw by using artificial scarcity, which is unfortunately a tactic that the oil barons and others have known about for hundreds of years now.
That's fascinating, man. And I like how you tie in the fact that some of it might have come from dinosaurs, and but the majority of it is being like created. I don't even know how you say that word, abiogenetically or whatever you said. Basically, it's being produced in the earth. That is really, really fascinating. And to me, it was just like, okay, yeah, well, we lied to about everything. No doubt that they would lie about that too. Okay, cool. And as well, from what I've seen, it seems like a lot of the green agenda or this push against oil is actually coming from the oil barons, if you like, because like you say, it actually raises the price.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
In fact, the anti-nuclear movement has some interesting ties into that as well, because again, what could be a potential threat to the oil industry? Cheap, plentiful nuclear energy. So there's a lot of that going on as well. Yes. Again, for people who don't understand the specifics of the connections between the oil barons and the rise of the environmental movement, I would specifically direct them to my Why Big Oil Conquered the World, where I go through the names of the actual people who are connected to the oil industry, to the Rockefellers, the Rockefeller family themselves, and the Rockefeller Foundation, and what is pushed, and the creation of the earliest environmental/conservation groups, like the World Wildlife Federation, which was started by a bunch of avowed eugenicists, many of whom were Rockefeller-connected oil barons as well, who have such concern for Mother Nature that they just want to take it all over in the auspices of the UN. Don't worry, it's all legitimate. It's under this big global governmental structure, and they're going to steward over the resources of the earth. What could go wrong?
Absolutely. Okay, cool. I think that will conclude part one. Is there have you got your website? Do you want to plug any social media as well that you have?
Not really. CorbettReport.com is the place to go. Thousands of hours of archives there, so please check it out.
Okay, great. Thanks for joining me, James.
No problem.